Welcome to another episode of the Tom Schimmer Podcast. Excited to kick off our summer series today with a roundtable discussion about universal design for learning. UDL, of course, is a framework that maximizes learning opportunities for all learners and is based on three main principles: multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, and multiple means of action and expression. Each of those principles has a fairly detailed set of guidelines and is really aimed at helping educators improve how we present information, how we engage students, and how we create more inclusive environments, especially more inclusive assessment environments. Now, at its best, UDL, while it won't eliminate it entirely, does reduce the need for special accommodations for students. Now, joining me today for this discussion are Fatima Sammy, Jackie Duncan, and Alisha Poling. Fatima Sammy is an 8th grade science teacher and a teacher leader at the Putnam Avenue Upper School in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Her teaching focuses on instructional practices and routines that enable students to develop into independent learners. Fatima also serves as an education consultant for the Diversity, Education, and Outreach Office of the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard. In that role, Fatima trains scientists to engage with students and collaborates on interactive biocoding curriculum. Jackie Duncan is the UDL District Coordinator and a high school English teacher within the Shelby City Schools in Shelby, Ohio. Jackie has taken a rather non-traditional path in education. It started with a tour in the U.S. Marine Corps, law enforcement as well, and a few other endeavors before she finally set her sights on earning her teaching degree. And I'm sure her students thank her for doing that. And Alisha Poling. Alicia is a special education teacher and a 504 monitor at Mark Twain Elementary School in Kirkland, Washington. Alicia has taught in both self-contained and resource room programs. Prior to teaching in Washington State, she has taught art for 5 years and special education for 1 year in the state of Tennessee. All right, let's talk universal design for learning. Here with me today to talk about all things universal design for learning are Fatima Sammy.
Good morning, Tom.
Good morning. We also have Jackie Duncan.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good to see you. And Alisha Poling.
Good morning, Tom.
Great to see you all. Great to have you here. Really looking forward to our conversation today. And we've got a lot to talk about. Really looking forward to it. Thank you again for taking time out of your busy schedules to join me today. And we're going to dig right into UDL because I think there's a lot we can talk about when it comes to, your journeys and some of the advice you have for teachers as they think about, forging ahead with their UDL journey. So I want to start with you and each of you and your breakthrough, the breakthrough you had during your UDL journey. And Fatima, I'm going to start with you, but I'm going to ask all three of you to respond to the following question. So you've heard about UDL, you learned about UDL, and maybe you started implementing some aspects of UDL, but then you had a moment, you hit a moment where you had this breakthrough, where you thought to yourself, oh, UDL, now I get it. I am totally all in now. I completely understand what this is all about. Fatima, let's start with you. What was that moment for you?
Yeah, sure, Tom. So I was introduced to UDL as part of our school improvement plan. And we had started by just watching some videos of Katie Novak and seeing some examples. And for me, the push to really implement it into my science classroom came as a result of frustration. Going through some summative assessments with my students after our climate change unit, where the curriculum called for students to write congressional memos to their representatives to understand the impacts and mitigation plans of climate change. And for the past 2 years, when I did it that way, I just received really, really low engagement. And about 50% of my students completed the assignment. So like I said, it was really just a moment of frustration for me, or my breaking point to say, I've got to do something differently. This is not working for my students. And started thinking, how can I incorporate UDL into my curriculum? So I started out small. I started out with that same summative assessment, and I changed the title. I called it Climate Change Stories. And in terms of engagement, I had students identify a focus area in the world and stress choosing an area that was of significance to them. So a lot of my students chose places that their family were from, or they visited or had a connection to. And then in terms of providing multiple means of representation, I created a list of resources to start kids off so they didn't feel stuck and didn't know where to start in their research. So I had some printed articles, infographics, databases, reference websites, and videos that they can pull from. And then I opened up their products or their prove-its. So they could do slides, posters, videos, Jamboards, infographics. Some kids even did TikToks. And once I sort of made those changes, I had about like 90 to 95% of my students completed that project. So that was sort of like my aha moment. I was like, kids can do this. We as educators have to provide the resources so they're able to engage in curriculum.
Jackie, any thoughts on your breakthrough? What sort of breakthroughs did you have? When was that moment where you thought that this is it? I'm never going back. This is what I'm going to be all about going forward.
I think it was like my third year in education. I was part of a Closing the Gap team. And with our local education service center, they taught us some UDL technique strategies, the whole thing. And I was really intrigued by it. I like to be really active in the classroom, and I love like feedback from my students. And what I realized is that I was doing a lot of the UDL strategies already, and a lot of teachers are, they just don't know it yet. It just makes you more intentional and streamlines how you do your planning. And when I figured that out, I was like, hey, I'm all on board. And I tried to suck up every bit of PD that I could find, every book, everything after that.
Absolutely. We are definitely going to dig into all of the learning that you all have done and all of the practical strategies that you offer in terms of your classroom and things that many teachers can learn from your experience. Alicia, let's go to you and talk about your breakthrough moment, your moment when you realized universal design for learning was what you were going to incorporate into your classroom from this point forward. What was that breakthrough moment for you?
Well, I had the opportunity to work with an educational consultant, and she kind of helped me understand the relationship between UDL and special education specifically. So, UDL does benefit all students, but oftentimes, as a special education teacher, I have kids that may have significant needs. And so it's like, how do we even make it bigger to support those students so that they can be included in the learning that's happening in their classroom? And so when I realized that UDL was the best method for lesson planning, and that the end result of UDL was that all kids get to learn in the least restrictive environment, as a special education teacher, I had been delivering services through a pull-out model. So kids had to leave what they were doing in their classroom to come receive their services with me. And so what she did is she helped me kind of make the switch so that kids, I can see how we can plan for all kids to stay in their classroom and receive what they need. And the critical thing she taught me was, if you look at the IDEA, the Individual with Disabilities Educational Act, and you really look at how SDI is defined, it says it's adapting as appropriate to the needs of an eligible student's the content, methodology, or delivery of instruction. So it says so you can pick one of those, right? And that you can call that SDI if that's what the IEP team decides, right? And as long as it's intentional and helping the student access general education curriculum, then you can count that as SDI, and kids can stay and be included in their classroom.
Yeah, it's certainly the foundation, as you mentioned right off the top there, Alicia. I love that reference to the idea that this isn't just specialized intervention. What is good for some learners is good for all learners. And we find that a lot of the strategies really are universally applicable. And that word universal design for learning, there are ways to benefit all learners, not just those who might be identified as needing finite or acute support or specialized support, for sure. Jackie, I want to come back to you now and ask you a little bit to be a little bit more specific about planning. Talk about your planning process. What does UDL planning look like, and how would you contrast, say, UDL planning from, say, the more traditional ways that teachers have planned units or planned lessons? How do you draw that contrast? What does that look like?
I think, well, especially for me, traditionally I was taught to start with the material. So course material that I would gravitate towards are things that would interest me. And when I did that, I was taking the student completely out of that equation. So with UDL, you start with the end product. Well, actually, let me rephrase that. You start with the standard. So you look at the standard first. And what I do is I try to keep it as simple as possible. I isolate the verbs. So what is it exactly looking for? What skill set do my students need to demonstrate? And then from there, it comes my favorite part, is designing the product. Okay. Mm-hmm. So I really enjoy that because I try to be really creative. Okay. I also am really transparent with my students. So I give them an overview of the process of how I do it. And then if they have some better ideas on this unit, or they've got some something else that they'd like to propose instead of what I have for the final product, or the options for the final product, I'm all for it. If it can hit the checkpoints and the standards that they need to, then why not develop that, bring it into the unit? But allowing the kids to be part of that process, you're empowering them, and it really keeps your units fresh and interesting.
So at our school, we have common planning. So what that means is twice a week, we have interventionists, which can be EL, English language teachers. It can be reading specialists, special education teachers, and gen ed teachers, all plan together twice a week. And so what that allows us to do is everybody can kind of take off their, or I guess we should say that we don't like categorize kids by like, oh, this is going to be for, these 4 kids that are EL. No, we don't do that. We take, we just kind of look through a lens of, I'm a specialist at special education, or I'm a reading specialist, and here's what I can provide to support all students. And so that way we've kind of taken the approach. We're no longer in silos. And so we are doing this collaboration planning, which really lets you get very creative about how to make sure that all kids are engaged in the lesson, which is critical. It's critical. And so that's what we do at our school. And it's great to have all these different people who have these different lenses that they're looking through to kind of figure out, what can I bring to the lesson? What's my piece of the puzzle? And so then when you're done, you end up with, a great lesson plan or unit plan that has all these different strategies and supports that allows all kids to learn, again, in their general education classroom.
Yeah, it's interesting, listening to Jackie and Alicia talking about your planning and how it's almost as if the focus shifts, right? We used to plan with the idea that how am I going to teach this content or these skills? And now the question is, how do I provide maximum access for all learners? How do I create the opportunity for all to have that support? Fatima, any thoughts on planning and how that's different as well for you?
I would agree both for Alicia and Jackie. I mean, I really want to emphasize that backward design strategy, starting when your standards are objective. And I'm always thinking, what do I want students to be able to master at the end of a unit or a lesson, and what's acceptable evidence of that? And then, doing the actual tasks that will lead to that and providing those options for students.
Such an important thing to think about the standards and beginning to think about. And I love the fact that you talk about, Jackie, highlighting the verbs, and Fatima and Alicia echoing those thoughts. The idea that the verb itself really does help you with the cognitive rigor of the standard and helps you with your assessment methods and helps you understand the ways to gather evidence of learning. Beyond the verb, we think about the depth of thinking required, and that backwards planning really does help us create those opportunities for the pathways to reach that proficiency. So I love that. Alicia, I want to come back to you. And, the topic has come up a couple of times already, but I want to talk about engagement. Teachers are constantly searching for answers for how to increase engagement and for how they can create resilient, kind of tenacious learners. Students, this timeless refrain we hear from students is that this is boring, or, why are we learning this? Or when am I ever going to use this in my life? we also see students who just kind of give up when learning gets tough. So I'm wondering about engagement and the sort of direct correlation between UDL, the UDL process, and how you can purposefully address the issue of engagement with your students.
Yeah, and this is something that I've witnessed and I'm extremely passionate about because, I have kids who have learning difficulties or kind of social, extra social struggles. And so, if they're in a classroom and they're not engaged, it's the achievement gap gets bigger, and so it's critical for me to work with the gen ed teachers to make sure that students are engaged in the learning. And a lot of times they have to understand why. Like, why do I need to learn this? Why? Because I have the why kids,
Yeah.
And so I have to make sure, like, well, this is why, it's important. And so I think that is just, that first piece is just having kids understand the why they're learning it. Is the first step in creating that engagement and relevance. And especially like during the past year, during this pandemic, engagement has been such at the forefront because I've had so many students who, at first we kind of had to tackle the connectivity issue and just like logistics. And then once you got kids connected to the material, it was like, how am I going to keep kids engaged in the learning through a computer? How am I going to keep kids engaged to have attention issues, like whenever they don't have anybody sitting next to them to make sure they're staying on top. So engagement has been critical during the remote learning. And so it's been interesting that so many teachers and we've all kind of worked to figure out how do we make sure, like, to keep them engaged. Number one, we've got to have engagement. Because if you don't have them engaged, then you can't do any, you can't do the rest of the stuff. So you've got to like get that hook in there. And so it's just been interesting to watch how my own teaching has really changed over the past year. I've had to do more interactive games, learn all these different platforms, anything I can do to, hook the kids in and to keep them engaged. So engagement is critical. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would agree, Alicia. Additionally, the why, it's huge. I know you mentioned your kids, but I think it's for all kids. All students want to know the why. So I think I've spent a lot of time in my own practice making sure I tell the kids the why, or tell them we are going to explore and discover the why along our process and this journey of learning whatever we may be learning, and also making sure it's authentically relevant for them. Making sure the kids can make a connection back to their own lives. And I first saw that when I had revamped my climate change story project, when kids were able to invest in a location that has significance important to them, the products that they produced were astronomically better than what it was when it's like I'm writing a letter to somebody who I know is not going to read it or it's not going to make any difference. So I think that's really, really important as well.
Mm-hmm.
To add to that, I think relationships that you build with students kind of alleviate this as well. Because if you're able to build those relationships, you're building trust. And if your students trust you, they're going to enter that learning environment with you. They're going to want to be there. It's not going to alleviate it altogether. You're always going to get the why am I here, but it really does help. And if you have, I don't know, half 3/4 of your class like, hey, yeah, I'm invested, the stragglers will follow.
Yeah. And feedback too, just to add on, getting feedback from kids. I've been very vulnerable with my students, like, we're going to try this. If you don't like it, be honest and we'll switch it up next class or next night. So just giving them feedback and that they have some input in their learning goes a long way as well.
My question back to the three of you would be, what do you do? I mean, not every sort of lesson, unit, topic is going to be relevant to every learner. So beyond the attempts to bring relevance, which I love the fact that all three of you have talked about that, what do you do in the situation where a teacher might come to you and say, look, the student's just telling me they're just not interested. They're not There's just no, how do you move past that? How do you help students see relevance where they don't see it, or that engagement where they don't feel it?
I think it goes back to what Jackie said, that relationship. I've worked with a lot of kids in the past that just, for whatever reason, they just don't want to do work. They just, and so it comes back to, if that relationship, like, this is what we need to do. This is going to be our job today. This is important, because this is your job today, so and so I'm going to help you. You don't have to do it alone. But it's kind of like that feeling, because there's usually, all behavior is communication. So if there's a reason they're not wanting to do the work, that's what we need to figure out. Like, why are they, what is the aversion? Is it a writing? Are they averse to writing? Is it, but we go back to, what are they trying to tell us through the behavior if they're not wanting to do the work? Does that make sense?
Yeah. And also, I think adding to that would be removing the barriers to that, right? So, and that's where UDL is so great at, being able to think ahead and say, what are the barriers that are going to prevent students from completing this task? And then once you've kind of tackled that, if there's still some pushback, I defer to my relationship with that student. And like Alicia says, okay, this is what we need to get done today. How can I support you in getting that done?
Just to add on to that, to echo both of what Alicia and Fatima are saying, our students they're complex individuals. They've got a lot of stuff going on. And so, I mean, if they come into a classroom and they don't feel respected, you're not going to be able to teach them anything. So being able to look at them through both of those lenses and to give them the space to listen to them and problem solve is really essential to having any working practice in your classroom.
Yeah, it's amazing how everything always seems to come back to relationships and what kind of environment we create and the kind of connections we have with our learners. Fatima, I want to come back to you now and ask you something I see quite common in my conversations with teachers and in sort of tangential conversations about UDL. I've heard many people assert, "Oh, UDL, I already do that because I've been differentiating my instruction since the mid 2000s. So, this is nothing new." So how do you answer somebody who says that? Because we know UDL and differentiation are not the same thing. So how do you respond to somebody who makes that statement to you? "Oh, I'm already doing that because I've been differentiating for the last 15 years.
Yeah, I would totally push back on that, Tom. I mean, I think UDL is more upstream, differentiation is downstream. So I see UDL as how you proactively are evaluating the classroom instruction, the environment, and then providing access on the front end for all students, right? Mm-hmm. So it focuses on variability of all students, it's proactive. I mean, you even evaluate your physical space in the classroom, right? It's how my desk or tables are arranged, a barrier to learning or for students completing a task, where differentiation is more reactive and it's more cause and effect, and it's more focused on individual students or conforming to the norm and not necessarily valuing the variety and planning for outside the margin kids. So that's how I would respond. Yes, and also I think the onus is also on the educator when you're planning for UDL versus differentiation. And I feel like with for UDL, once you've kind of set in, you got the groove going, it's so much easier. Where differentiation, I feel like you're always playing catch up, right? You can never get caught up because then you differentiate for one student, then you got to differentiate for the other, as opposed to if you remove barriers for all students, then you're good to go.
Exactly what Fatima said. UDL is proactive, not reactive. And I am kind of stubborn. So when I first heard about UDL, I was like, this is differentiated instruction. And they were like, no, it's not. And so I was one of those people who were very skeptical. But once I kind of opened my mind and listened and understood that, no, it is different because it's proactive. We're talking about the planning process versus the in the moment instructional decision making. And so then I started like, oh, okay, because I am also the 504 monitor at our school. So I teach, I have IEPs and kids on 504s. And so when I started seeing that, you mean the teacher is going to already have all of the supports in place and materials in place for students, that may have, unique needs. Oh, well, those things can help all kids. And yeah, this is a great idea, because then you're not like putting fires out, right? You're coming in, you have a plan, and it's a very intentional plan so that all kids, again, are engaged. Because if they're all engaged, then they're learning, right? So that was the like, oh, it is different, so yeah, I was one of those people. So
I was just going to say, I love Fatima's analogy of upstream and downstream. I've never heard that before, and I think it's fabulous. But with Alicia, I too was like, okay, I differentiate, like I do that stuff. But I think especially like with any teaching strategy, it's a tool, right? UDL is a tool, but it's a tool that you're constantly evaluating. And I think that's important because you're evaluating yourself, you're letting your students evaluate you as well. And so you're always honing. And the other thing I wanted to say was that it ensures that the focus stays on the student and that your methods are completely accessible. Okay. And you're empowering the learners. They're not passive. It's not a passive learning environment. And you develop independent learners as well. I don't think you can say that when you're just differentiating. So,
well, one thing I wanted to add is a lot of times this is the reality of what would happen. So if let's say a student of mine has significant struggles with reading, sometimes what would happen was if they're all doing a lesson and the student is really struggling, an alternative activity would be given to that student. And, right then you've changed the trajectory, And so with UDL, we don't have to create those alternative activities. We are including all kids that are in the learning that has taken place. And so we're no longer changing the trajectory, and so we're not the gatekeepers anymore. And I think that's critical in the cultural shift that needs to occur.
Yeah. Second ditto. And it almost, when I am implementing a lesson that's fully UDL, I feel like I could sit back and I'm the facilitator, right? Mm-hmm. The kids are in control of their learning. And the only thing I need to control is when I'm checking in or when they're doing their whip around, share out. But it really is kids who are in control of their learning and they are able to do it.
So question for anyone to jump in here, because I think it's important that we not maybe give the wrong impression to teachers, which is even though we plan for, proactively and we think about removing barriers and creating up maximum opportunities for students to access the learning, you are still going to have some students who emerge as being sort of unresponsive and requiring, say, tier 2 interventions and supports. So are we talking about minimizing the number of students who might require that supplemental support? Are we talking about, giving ourselves the opportunity to maximize our minutes by reducing the number of students who might emerge versus the traditional planning, which is I teach it this way, and those of you who don't get it, I then will differentiate for you. Is that what we're talking about here?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, so one of the things that I have kind of created and once again, because I'm the 504 monitor, I've seen like the tiered interventions. So if you have like supports in place, let's say in the environment, for example, accommodations that used to be on 504 plans and IEPs are access to break space, differentiated writing tools, special paper, sentence starters, all of these things that, required a plan are now being considered best teaching practices. And so what has happened is you have all of these supports in place for kids, at whatever, wherever they are in the process of the learning that they can access. And I have seen a reduction in the amount of kids who go on to need like more tiered interventions. We've been able to, we've been able to change the LRE, which is the least restrictive environment, for a lot of my kids who qualify in reading, because all of these, they're getting assistive technology in the classroom. They're getting it read aloud. They're getting all these supports put in place. So and sometimes they just have trouble reading, right? Their comprehension, they can comprehend everything. They just have trouble reading. And now that they're having all of these tools in place and all kids are being able to access these, they don't have to leave their classroom, and or they are exiting from reading on the IEP process.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just an amazing thing to watch. But yes, absolutely, it makes the difference.
Yeah.
I also think it gives me, at least in my space, it gives me a little more time to spend with those kids who do need a little more individualized attention. So when everybody else is fine, I could spend an extra few minutes checking in with a student who may need more of my time, where if I wasn't implementing UDL, then I'm sort of like strapped for that time because I can't get to everyone within my 50-minute class time.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and one of the strategies we just talked about at a planning session we had the other day, we're doing like a UDL math unit mock thing to kind of introduce teachers to the planning process, more teachers. And so one of the things we talked about is, how we can use like in our system, it's level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4. That's what grades are, mm-hmm. right? And so one of the things we talked about, exactly what Fatima was saying, is empowering maybe the kids who are getting the concept and having them become teachers, because doing the activity and demonstrating proficiency is one skill. Teaching it requires additional skills. So why not go take it a step further and empower students that are able to grasp it easier, and help them, give them the power to be instructional models in the classroom. I mean, it's like a win-win for everybody, right? And so just things like that, changing that mind shift where it's putting the control back into the kid's hand, like Fatima said. We're facilitators now. It's a huge, it's amazing to watch.
And to echo both of those, I think it really allows us, our students that are really struggling, it gives us time to put in some interventions that may need to be done outside of the classroom. So we can look at the support systems we have and find out exactly how we can support them in other areas of their life. I think that's really important as well.
It's interesting because when you think about each tier of intervention is subsequently more labor intensive. And so the investment in universal strategies is a way of preventing sort of an emergence of students being unresponsive. We all know that we're all busy. Teachers, I don't know an educator that's not busy. And so really becomes an issue of how do we distribute our minutes? How do we provide support? So if our universal design is able to bring more students, into the learning at a more efficient way, then we have more time for those who need that supplemental support at the tier 2 level, because each tier, again, is going to be much more labor intensive and more focused on the individual versus a targeted group-based kind of intervention at tier 2. So I appreciate the proactive nature of that, because I think whenever you're proactive, you're in a little bit more control. And I don't mean control from a I'm trying to control the students, but what I mean is you're in more control over how you respond. You can plan, you can anticipate, versus a differentiation piece or thinking about, I always have to react to what emerges, and being able to proactively plan for that is always more efficient. So Jackie, let's pivot now to assessment. At first glance, teachers might feel overwhelmed with the prospect of assessment with UDL, especially with the idea of students, being afforded multiple opportunities and multiple means to show what they know. So what are some of the key aspects for you, from your perspective? What are some of the key aspects of assessment that sort of honor the true spirit of UDL without teachers feeling completely stressed out about assessment?
Well, like I said before, I like to keep it simple. So it can be really overwhelming for a teacher when you get first acquainted with UDL and you start looking at options to be like, wow, how am I supposed to keep up with offering so many different assessments, and the grading is going to be insane. I like to keep it into groups of 3. So when I evaluate my standard and I look at what I'm decide what skill they're going to be assessed on, I develop 3 options for the final project or end of the lesson when they are demonstrating their skill. And then again, like I said, I'm transparent. So I tell the kids, hey, if they've got a better idea or they have something that they'd like to add to it, or they think that this can be streamlined, I'm all for it. And we look at it together and see if it's hitting all of the requisites I have.
Yeah, very similar to Jackie. I do the same thing. And I shared earlier that it was actually coined by my social studies teacher and on my team. He's pathways, right? So it doesn't matter how you get there, as long as by the end of the lesson of the unit, we know that you can master the skill. And so there's always a learn it option, and then you approve it, sort of like the assessment piece. So I also like to provide 3 options, and then other it, where students are able to check in with me and pitch me an idea. And along with that prove it section, there's always a criteria of success that, connects back to the standards and what skills students should be able to master or do or show. And so I just create that criteria of success based on the standards, and then kids show me they approve it. So whether they write it, they draw it, they create a video, a song, a poem, as long as those criteria of success and standards are in there, then that works. And then everybody's being graded on the same criteria. And I don't need a separate criteria because you drew me a picture versus you wrote something.
Well, I'm going to echo what Fatima said about, the pathway might look a little bit different, but as long as they can demonstrate proficiency of the skill, or, just progress, learning progress, then I think, we should kind of open up the different ways that kids can demonstrate what they know. Some of the things, that I think about when I think about assessment is, how are we going to remove barriers? If you have a multiple choice test, like we have so many multiple choice tests, and they're not the most culturally responsive tests. Let's just be honest. And so, and so it's, how can we, allow kids to show what they know? If the district tells us we have to give a multiple choice test for this topic, and so I think just kind of having that conversation, and again, in the planning process versus trying to, be reactive. And then also grading. Like I get asked all the time, well, what am I supposed to give them a grade on? I gave them all these supports, and I'm like, well, their parents are aware that they have these in their plan. So when you give them a grade, the parent knows it's because of these supports that they got, earned a level 3. It's, because teachers have this thing of like, but I want to know independently what they can do. And I'm like, but why not just, can we catch them being successful? Like, how about changing the mindset, and, if they can be successful with supports, great. We've done our job, so I think it's just that shift again.
Yeah, creating especially the accommodations we make for some learners are actually what creates fairness and equity. It's not unfair. It's an opportunity for students to have equal opportunity to be successful, because we have removed those barriers. And some of the barriers mean we have to provide those additional supports for those learners as we go. So, Alicia, I want to stick with you, because you brought up the idea of culturally responsive assessments, and I'm thinking about UDL as a framework for maximizing the opportunity for inclusion and equity. And so you brought up, cultural responsiveness and equity for all learners, but also equity from a racial equity or a culturally responsive. And I'm going to ask all 3 of you to jump in on this in a moment. But what is it about UDL that gives educators the clearest opportunity to create true equity in our schools?
Well, if we think about the public school system, to me, in my opinion, it's the last attempt to level the playing field, right? And
Mhm.
so I feel like we have a moral obligation to do everything that we can to include all students. And to me, it always comes back to inclusion, because we have a history of segregation and oppression, right? Especially of certain demographics. And so, if you look and see what segregation did to groups of people, we need to do whatever we can to be inclusive. And so, as someone who works with kids with disabilities, it really comes back to me, like, what do I need to do, or what can I do to help students access the learning that has taken place, so they don't have to be excluded and leave their classroom to go receive some magic potion in another location. So, because special education is a service, right? It should be portable. So, and I've had kids who, especially when they get to like third and fourth and fifth grade, they don't want to leave their classroom, and so, once again, and they'll say, I don't want to leave what my peers are doing. I don't want to, because I'm not having this picture of success, or what society has deemed a success, I don't want to have to leave the group of what my friends are doing and go and be segregated. And so, and we know that there's a disproportionate amount of kids in special education. So it's like inclusion. It all comes back to inclusion. And so, UDL, in my opinion, is the way to include all kids, because
Yeah.
what works, like you said it earlier, what works for some kids actually benefits all kids. So why not do whatever we can to include all kids?
So this is going to echo a lot of what Alicia was just saying, but to keep it really short, pathways, there's not one pathway, and each of our students are unique and they all have a different path. Each of their paths are going to be different, and so we need to respect that. But UDL focuses on accessibility and empowerment, which I think it makes it very powerful in the classroom in that way. So I feel like I keep saying this, but it's really important. Relationships are the most important thing in the classroom, and you have to be authentic. And the students need to know that you respect them, who they are, and where they come from. And I think that is a really great piece on racial equity and cultural responsiveness. But to do that, you got to know who they are. So I think that's how I would sum that up for me.
Yeah, for sure. Fatima, from your perspective, I think one of the things that we noticed during the pandemic that was magnified was how we define success. And it's no secret that success in school, achievement in school, has been very narrowly defined through a kind of white Eurocentric lens of what is acceptable evidence. Mm-hmm. So from your perspective, how does UDL begin to create a more culturally expansive learning environment for all learners?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's so important, and one that I think all educators need to dig a little deeper to figure out how they do that within their own teaching and within their schools. But I mean, UDL is intentional. In order to implement UDL, you have to be intentional, because the planning piece is so big in the sense of you are sitting down and saying, how can I remove barriers so all my students can be successful? So I think that intentional piece is key here. And I think UDL, what it does really well too, is it kind of tackles and dismantles some of that white supremacy cultural teaching that I was taught when I was learning to become an educator, is specifically that there's only one right way to do things in a classroom or to teach, right? Or students having to conform to the normal and defining what normal teaching practice is. So I think what UDL is making sure there is accessibility for all students by recognizing that their variability to learn. And obviously that was heightened during the pandemic.
Yeah, the pandemic definitely highlighted some of the frustration. I mean, it initially started with frustration that teachers had that some of their traditional work, the things they'd had students do from assignments to demonstrations to performances, just didn't transfer to the home environment. And it really did expose, and And I don't mean that necessarily in a completely negative way, but it did expose the necessity to have some conversations that may have been put off, and having to have a conversation about what is quality evidence and how can students demonstrate their learning. I think those teachers like yourselves who are well versed in UDL practices and processes are able to create those kind of inclusive environments as well. I think it's a great opportunity for us to redefine what it means to show what you know, or to reach proficiency with the standards that we're teaching. Fatima, I want to stick with you on this last question as we finish up today. And we're going to sort of take the big picture look and thinking about advice to teachers as they get started. So Fatima, what advice do you have for teachers? Okay, they've listened to the three of you. They've been dabbling in UDL a little bit. They've read some books. They've maybe gone to an online professional learning experience or a conference in years past. And now they're kind of ready to get started, but they're hesitant because they're not sure what to do first. So what advice, and I'm going to come to all three of you on this, what advice do you have for a teacher who is looking to begin their UDL journey? Like, how should they get started?
Start with your standards and objectives. That is the clearest way to know that students are going to be able to master what they need to master. And when I started, it was hard because in science, it wasn't clear cut. There was times I had to do lab. I'm like, well, how am I going to UDL a lab? So using my standards and know what students had to be able to master, what skills they need to have at the end of the unit was really crucial and helpful in terms of then that backward design and then working through your individual lessons or tasks or activities to help students reach mastery. Yeah.
Starting with the standards is always a great place to begin because you understand what the end goal is and what the demonstration should reach. Jackie, for you, advice for teachers getting started with their UDL journey.
Okay, so I would say don't get overwhelmed. Start small, do one lesson, one unit, and you're going to see improvement. Your students are going to be more engaged. And when you see that, you're going to be hooked. You're going to want to do more. UDL is going to help you be more intentional with your students and with your own practice. And you're going to see all those gains that you want in your classroom.
Great. Alicia, advice to teachers getting started.
Well, I would say don't be stubborn. Be teachable, right? Because I really had to change my whole mindset of what learning looks like, what a classroom looks like, and celebrate neurodiversity. How awesome is it that there's so many different kids? We're all different. I tell my kids all the time, it would be so boring if everybody was the same. Right. And so really just embracing that, the fact that we're all different. And another thing I would say is a lot of the times that the curriculum that we have is most kids or all kids can access that. There's no need for replacement curriculum anymore. And if especially the biggest thing I can say is to presume competence. So when you have a student in your classroom and maybe you've gotten some information and you're skeptical, take a step back and always presume competence because all kids can learn.
Yeah, great advice for teachers getting started. Certainly, I love the advice of starting small. It is cliche, think big, start small, but it's important that we start to be confident and competent in what we're pursuing. Certainly, when it comes to the assessment piece, providing opportunities, maybe we don't start off by giving students a wide range of opportunities, but at least there is some choice. There is some agency. There's an opportunity to show what they know. And if they come to you, as a few of you mentioned earlier, if they come to you with another idea, then we'd be open to that they can show their learning in that way. So it really does put the spotlight on the students. So Jackie, Alicia, Fatima, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. I really think there's a lot to learn, still lots to grow. A lot of us learning about UDL and continuing to grow in this area, but your advice and your insight has been most helpful. So thanks for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
This podcast is a proud member of the Teach Better Podcast Network. Better today, better tomorrow, and the podcast to get you there. You can find out more at teachbetter.com/podcasts. Now let's get back to the episode.
One of the most powerful tools every teacher has in their instructional tool belt is anticipation. Our ability to anticipate learning inhibitors, our ability to anticipate potential misunderstandings, and to anticipate engagement opportunities is a powerful tool, if we use it. Anticipation is at the heart of being proactive. I know that word gets thrown around a lot, but being proactive is the only way we will create real equity and inclusion in our schools. Now contrast that with the traditional paradigm. It says sort of, I teach a concept this one singular way. Or to take it even further, I teach everything this singular way. And when students struggle or simply need longer to learn, their internal dialogue will quite likely turn to, what's wrong with me? This, of course, gets magnified when teachers express, well, I taught it, you didn't learn it. The I taught it, you didn't learn it refrain is code for it's your fault, or there must be something wrong with you because most everyone else got it. Now, teachers, of course, are not saying that outright. It's kind of the way the system has been set up, or at least it's how the system of teaching and learning has been conditioned and sustained. There will always be a need for reaction and interventions. No pedagogy, curriculum, or formative assessment strategy is foolproof. There will always be a need for Tier 2 and Tier 3 intervention strategies. But here's the question. Do you want to go wide, or do you want to go deep with the distribution of your instructional minutes? When you consider an RTI or an MTSS or a PBIS 3-tiered continuum, all the same logic, remember that the target numbers are malleable. Most of us know that the target number for each tier sits in order at 80%, 15%, and 5%. Right? So Tier 1, which is the universal tier of prevention. Let me say that again. The universal tier of prevention, see the word universal is right there, is set at about 80%. In other words, you can gauge the success or lack thereof of your Tier 1 strategies or your Tier 1 approach by whether or not roughly 80% of your students have been positively responsive. Okay, so that leaves 20% remaining. Tier 2, referred to, of course, as a secondary tier or of supplemental support, the success rate there is gauged at an additional 15%, right? So this is a targeted group-based support level, and it's generally thought to be successful if only 5% of your population remain unresponsive to that tier's intervention. So between Tier 1 and Tier 2, we should be targeting about a 95% success rate, right? So usually this, at Tier 2, we're talking about an existing structure or system in the school that the student, should it be necessary, can be programmed into rather quickly. The remaining 5%, that's where we hit Tier 3, individualized support. So if Tier 2 is about fitting the student into an existing structure or existing program, Tier 3 is about building the program of intervention and support to the individual. So I like to refer to the 3 tiers along the lines of 3 Ps. Tier 1 is the tier of prevention. Tier 2 is the tier of program. Not a shrink wrap binder, but an existing structure, system, etc. of supplemental support. And Tier 3 is about being personalized. So prevention, program, personalized. And each tier, this is a really important point, each tier of intervention is subsequently more labor intensive than the previous one. But the levels are fluid, and we have to remember that. There's an investment piece in what we do with UDL. So if you, for example, take a very narrow approach to instruction, you could be looking at, I'm just going to throw numbers out here for effect, you could be looking at, say, a 70% success rate at Tier 1 versus an 80%. So that leaves 30% remaining, which means your Tier 2 could become, 20% versus 15%. And that leaves Tier 3 at 10%. Tier 3, a 10% Tier 3, is unsustainable. No school has the time, the budget, the breadth of expertise to have a plus 10% Tier 3. Okay, so if you have a 10% or a 15% or a 20% Tier 3, then you have a Tier 1 issue. You have figuratively pushed students through the triangle, if you will, or through the pyramid, with either narrow choices or poor choices at the previous tiers. Now, with a 10%, 15%, 20% Tier 3, now it's triage. But remember, okay, again, each tier is more labor intensive, but what if we invest in UDL? what if we proactively plan to maximize success at the universal level of intervention, and that's Tier 1? We invest in all learners, removing all barriers right from the start. So if we do that, there is a very real chance that 80% at Tier 1 becomes 90%. Again, just putting numbers out there for effect. 15% becomes, 7%. And 5% at Tier 3 becomes 3%. So the 80, 15, and 5 becomes, hypothetically, 90, 7, and 3. Well, what's the big deal about that? It's a massive deal, okay? Because in a school, for example, of 1,500 students, the difference between a 5% and a 3% Tier 3, we're talking 30 students. So we're talking about 75 individual student support plans versus 45, okay? 30 fewer students on individualized support plans in a school of 1,500 students. That's a massive difference. Because in schools, now, in schools where specialized services are siloed, a teacher might not notice, but in a collective environment where the responsibility is shared, there's no such thing as your kids and my kids and regular kids and all of that stuff. It makes a huge deal. Again, you have the same number of minutes distributed to 45 students versus 75 students. I mean, common sense tells us we're going to be more successful. And of course, this also includes, at Tier 1, taking a more culturally expansive view of the entire instructional process, where so often racialized students are seen to need special services, when in fact the issue is an exclusionary pedagogy, exclusionary curriculum, and exclusionary assessment practices. And just think back to the conversation I had with Yvette Jackson back in May. The need for interventions and special services and personalized strategies will always be present in our schools, but an investment in understanding the UDL guidelines and making UDL your default planning framework is how we're going to live up to the promises made by so many of our mission statements. It's how we're going to live up to the promises we made to ourselves when we entered this profession and we dedicated ourselves to making a difference. It's how we are going to truly achieve excellence for all. Remember to follow the podcast to stay up to date. That's at Tom Schimmer Pod on Twitter, and you can also follow me on Twitter at Tom Schimmer. Schimmer Education on Facebook, Tom Schimmer Podcast on Instagram, and Tom Schimmer Podcast on YouTube. You can also email the podcast, tomschimmerpod@gmail.com. Please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, especially on Apple Podcasts, of course. And please keep spreading the word about the podcast. I really appreciate it. Happy summer, everyone.